Karen's wedding guests blocked my driveway, so my hungry dogs led them straight into the mud pit. Before we dive into the story, let us know where you're watching from. It was a quiet Saturday morning on the ranch, just the way I liked it. The sun was barely up, casting that soft golden light over the sprawling fields. The dogs were already out doing their rounds, sniffing around and making sure everything was as it should be. It was the perfect start to a day. But of course, nothing ever stays perfect for long. I had planned to spend the day getting some work done. Maybe a little quiet time with the dogs, some time on the tractor, just the usual ranch things. But when I walked out of the house to head out for the morning, I froze in my tracks. There, right in front of my driveway, were three cars parked in the most inconvenient way possible. Not just on the edge, mind you. These cars were blocking the entire driveway. I couldn't even make it past them if I tried. The kind of situation that happens when people forget or just don't care about anyone else. And to make it worse, it was a wedding day, Karen's wedding to be exact. Now, Karen wasn't exactly the type to follow the rules. She was one of those people who, for reasons only she could explain, thought it was okay to use the ranch's long, gravel driveway as a spot to park for her guests. A big no-no for someone who's usually a stickler for order and space. I knew I'd have to deal with this, but little did I know, my dogs were about to take matters into their own paws. So there I was, standing at the edge of my property, staring at the blocked driveway, with the soft hum of the wedding festivities just behind me. Guests were milling around, and no one seemed to notice or care that I couldn't even get to my own land without making a scene. I sighed, thinking of the day ahead, already knowing this wasn't going to be as peaceful as I had hoped. Karen, of course, had always been a bit of a character. She wasn't someone you'd forget easily, always the life of the party, a bit loud, and always organizing something. She had this knack for making everything feel like a bigger deal than it really was. So when she announced she was hosting her wedding at the ranch, I knew it would be, well, eventful, to say the least. I wasn't exactly thrilled about it, but she was a good friend of a neighbor, and she insisted that the wide, open space would be perfect for her dream wedding, the kind of rustic charm that only a ranch could offer. I figured I could at least keep my distance, help out if needed, and stay out of the way. I had no intention of being a part of the chaos. The day of the wedding rolled around, and things seemed to be going smoothly at first. The ceremony was set to happen at the far end of the property, so I thought I'd be safe. Out of sight, out of mind. But as the first guests started arriving, I began to notice a pattern. Cars were coming in, parking one by one along the driveway, blocking it completely. Now, the thing with my driveway is that it's not exactly built for heavy traffic, especially not when people park like they're oblivious to anyone else. It's narrow, winding, and needs to stay clear for the trucks that come through, whether it's for ranch work or deliveries. I walked out to see what was going on, and sure enough, there they were, parked cars everywhere. Some were even halfway off the road, blocking both lanes. At first, I figured they'd move soon, but as more cars pulled up, the situation only worsened. Guests were milling around, excited, chatting away, and completely unaware of the inconvenience they were causing. No one had bothered to check with me about where they should park. Karen had just assumed it would be fine. I tried to remain calm, but the longer I stood there, the more I realized how much this was throwing off my day. I had plans. I had things to do. But now I couldn't even get out of my own driveway without potentially causing a scene or interrupting the wedding. It wasn't just the parking that frustrated me. It was the fact that no one seemed to care. The sense of entitlement, as if my land and routine were nothing more than a backdrop for their celebration, was starting to get under my skin. And of course, there was no sign of Karen. She was probably somewhere inside, wrapped up in wedding bliss, oblivious to the mess her guests were making. The ranch dogs weren't just pets. They were part of the operation. Each one had a role to play, and they took those roles seriously. There was Diesel, the oldest, a large graying shepherd mix with a no-nonsense attitude. He was the watchdog, the first to sense anything out of the ordinary. Then there was Luna, a quick and agile border collie, always ready to herd anything that strayed too far from the group, whether that was cattle or, on occasion, a stray car. And finally, there was Duke, the young and energetic lab, who was always in the middle of everything, barking at the wind and trying to keep up with the others. The dogs had been with me for years, growing up alongside the ranch and learning the ropes just as I did. They were smart, loyal, and surprisingly independent. Diesel, in particular, had a knack for sensing trouble before it even showed up, while Luna could herd anything with precision, even a group of oblivious wedding guests if she needed to. Every day they did their rounds, patrolling the perimeter of the ranch, checking on the cattle, and keeping an eye out for anything that didn't belong. They knew the land better than anyone else, so when something unexpected happened, like guests blocking the driveway, the dogs didn't hesitate to react. I didn't have to ask them to help with situations like this. They just knew. Over time, the dogs had learned to deal with anything from the occasional lost hiker to the more serious task of chasing off wild animals that wandered too close to the property. They didn't care who you were. If you weren't supposed to be here, you'd feel their presence. But what made the bond with the dogs truly special wasn't just their ability to protect and herd. It was the understanding between us. There was an unspoken connection, a mutual respect built over years of working side by side. They trusted me to lead, and I trusted them to follow. I didn't need to say much. A look or a simple hand gesture was enough. And today, with all the chaos from Karen's wedding, it seemed like the dogs were already tuned into the tension in the air. It was almost as if they knew something was about to happen, something I didn't have to worry about handling alone. The wedding guests were a mixed bag, to say the least. Most of them were family and friends, probably excited about Karen's big day and caught up in the celebrations. I couldn't fault them for that. Weddings are supposed to be fun, right? But it was clear that, in all their excitement, they had zero awareness of the world outside of the ceremony. It was as if the entire ranch had been transformed into a backdrop for their own personal event, and anything outside the wedding bubble just didn't matter. Some guests were friendly enough, offering smiles as they arrived, but there were also plenty who didn't seem to have a clue about where they were parking. The cars just kept rolling in, each one pushing further down the driveway, stopping wherever there was space, sometimes blocking the narrow path completely. No one was really paying attention to the fact that it wasn't just a wedding venue. This was someone else's home. They were too busy chatting, admiring the setting, and taking photos to even notice how they were making it impossible for me to leave or get any work done. At first, I gave them the benefit of the doubt. I thought maybe they'd move once they saw I was stuck. I didn't want to be the grumpy neighbor, so I tried to stay calm. I pulled up to my own driveway in my truck, expecting the guests to see me and shift over a little. I waited for a few moments, hoping someone would notice the problem and move their cars. But no luck. Instead, I watched as a couple of guests wandered up to one of the cars, chatting with each other, completely unaware of the situation. They seemed more interested in the flowers or how good they looked in their wedding outfits than in the fact that I couldn't even get my truck through the narrow gap between their vehicles. A few cars even blocked my truck in completely, and I could already feel the frustration building. I honked my horn, not aggressively, just enough to make them aware. But they looked over, shrugged, and waved as if to say, "Hey, we're busy here. Hold on." I tried to maneuver around them, but it wasn't happening. There was no way to get around the vehicles without scratching my truck or making a scene. I thought about knocking on a few doors, asking politely if someone could move their car, but with the wedding in full swing, I knew I'd get caught in more small talk than anything useful. The whole thing was a slow, building irritation, like a small leak that eventually floods everything around it. I could feel the frustration tightening in my chest as I sat there, stuck, watching more guests arriving and parking without a care. Each minute that passed, I realized how much my entire morning had been derailed by this single thoughtless act. All I wanted was to move my truck and get back to the ranch, but now it seemed like I was in the middle of a mess that was only getting worse. I knew I had to handle this carefully. I didn't want to make a scene at Karen's wedding, not when everything seemed to be going smoothly on her end, but I was running out of options and my patience was wearing thin. So I took a deep breath and made my way toward the nearest car, parked right at the edge of the driveway. I knocked lightly on the window, hoping to get someone's attention without causing a fuss. The driver, a middle-aged woman with large sunglasses perched on her nose, looked up, startled. I gave her a polite smile, trying to stay calm. "Hey, excuse me. Could you move your car?" "I can't get out of the driveway," I said, gesturing toward my truck, which was now completely blocked by her car. She blinked, then slowly lowered the window. "Oh, I'm sorry, I didn't realize," she said, though her tone didn't exactly sound apologetic. More like she was too caught up in the event to care much about my inconvenience. "But you see, the wedding is starting soon, and I'm not sure if I can move it right now." I could feel my frustration creeping up. "I understand that, but I'm stuck here. I need to get out." I pointed again to the cluster of cars blocking the rest of the driveway, hoping the message would get through. She just looked at me for a second, then shrugged. "Can't you just wait? The ceremony is going to start in a few minutes, and I really don't want to miss it." I could barely believe what I was hearing. I mean, sure, the wedding was important, but so was my ability to leave my own property. Trying to remain civil, I said, "Look, I'll just need a few minutes, but I really need to get my truck through here. Could you move your car just enough for me to get by?" She hesitated for a moment, then shook her head. "I'm not moving it until after the ceremony. You'll have to wait." I stood there for a second, unsure if she was serious. It was becoming clear that she wasn't going to move no matter what I said. My blood was starting to simmer. I turned around and saw more cars parked further down the driveway, some of them completely blocking the entrance. A few guests were chatting, ignoring the growing issue. I didn't want to escalate things, but it was becoming impossible to ignore. I tried to remain patient and polite, but at this point, I had already spent a good 15 minutes standing there, hoping someone would do the right thing. Instead, it seemed like the guests were only getting more defensive as they saw me standing there. One of the other guests, a young man in a tuxedo, noticed me standing by the cars and sauntered over. "What's the problem? You can't just wait until the ceremony's over?" he asked, his voice a little too casual, a little too dismissive. I tried to explain again, but it felt like I was talking to a brick wall. "I'm not asking for much. Just move the cars a bit so I can get out," I said, feeling the tension rise in my chest. He waved me off, clearly uninterested. "Well, I'm not moving anything. You'll have to figure it out." It was like each person I spoke to was just as uninterested and defensive as the last, and the more I tried to reason with them, the more I felt like I was the one being unreasonable. It was starting to feel less like a misunderstanding and more like an intentional disregard for my problem. The situation wasn't just frustrating anymore. It was escalating, and I knew I couldn't just stand there much longer, waiting for things to magically resolve themselves. As the tension built, I couldn't help but notice the dogs had started paying attention to the commotion. Diesel, always the first to sense something off, stood at the top of the driveway, his ears perked and his eyes scanning the scene. Luna, the ever-watchful collie, was close by, her tail twitching with interest. Even Duke, the young lab, was now trotting around, tail wagging but with a keen eye on what was happening. It's funny how they seem to know when things are about to get out of hand. Diesel took a few slow steps toward the cars, his posture firm and watchful, as if he was weighing his options. Luna, ever the strategist, trotted up beside him, and I could see her calculating the best way to herd these clueless wedding guests back in line. They were already circling around the cars, a little confused as to why these people weren't following the usual rules of the land. The guests, of course, were too caught up in their own little world to notice. One of them, a man in a crisp suit, tried to walk toward his car, but Diesel was already there, standing in front of him like a silent barrier. Diesel didn't bark, didn't growl. He just stood there, unwavering, blocking the way. The man hesitated, a little unsure of what to do, but Diesel wasn't about to make things easy. Luna, ever the helpful partner, moved in from behind, nudging him forward in a way that made it clear he wasn't getting through without the dog's say-so. And that's when things took a turn for the interesting. The guests started to move, but not in the way they expected. Luna began guiding them along the edge of the driveway, herding them like a bunch of wayward cattle. At first they were confused, looking over at me as if to say, "What's going on here?" But then they started following the dog's subtle nudges, unknowingly heading straight toward the muddy pit. Duke, always eager to be involved, was practically bouncing around the area, darting in and out between the cars, adding to the chaos. I could see the guests' confusion turn to frustration as they tried to make sense of what the dogs were doing. But by now it was too late to change course. Diesel and Luna had them on a path they didn't even realize they were on, and the muddy pit that had been barely visible from the driveway now loomed ahead, ready to swallow whatever came its way. The first car, a shiny black sedan, was the first to reach the edge. The tires slid slightly as the guests made their way down, and the driver, still oblivious, kept rolling forward. Diesel, now standing a few feet away, watched with an almost amused expression. Luna stood just behind the car, making sure the path remained clear, though not exactly preventing the inevitable. With a sudden lurch, the car's tires sank deep into the mud, the wheels spinning helplessly. The driver's eyes widened, and the guests in the car started yelling, trying to figure out how to get out. It wasn't long before more cars followed, each one guided by the dogs toward the same fate. The sound of spinning tires mixed with frustrated voices as the guests realized they'd somehow been led straight into the muck. The dogs didn't do anything dramatic. They didn't bark or chase them down. They just moved with a quiet precision, guiding them, nudging them, and without meaning to, leading them right into the mess they had created. I couldn't help but watch in awe as the dogs, calm and confident, did what they'd been trained to do: take charge. The first car's tires slid in slow motion as it crept closer to the edge of the muddy pit. The driver, completely unaware of what was about to happen, pressed the gas pedal a little harder, thinking it would just ease over the soft patch of earth. But the moment the wheels made contact with the mud, there was a sickening squish, followed by a series of jerking movements as the car sunk deeper into the muck. A loud gasp escaped from the passenger side as the car came to a sudden halt, the tires spinning uselessly in the thick, sticky mud. I could hear the guests inside shouting at each other, "What the hell? And why won't it move?" But the car wasn't going anywhere. The wheels just kept spinning, sending up small splashes of mud that only added to the chaos. And Diesel, he stood there, watching the whole thing unfold like he'd planned it all along. His eyes were calm, almost amused, as he shifted his weight and turned toward the next car in line, guiding it right toward the same fate. It wasn't long before another car approached, a sleek white SUV driven by a woman in a bright pink dress, her hair pulled into an immaculate updo. She had no idea what was about to happen as she rolled forward, following the invisible trail the dogs had set. By the time she saw the car in front of her, stuck in the mud, it was already too late. Her eyes widened as she hit the same spot, and her tires began to sink with the same sickening squish. She hit the brakes, but the car didn't stop. The front bumper slid downward, the back end lifted slightly, and before long, she was stuck, her SUV halfway tilted, wheels spinning in circles. From the sound of it, the frustration was quickly turning into full-blown panic. "Oh no, no, no!" the woman screamed, slamming her hands against the wheel. "I'm going to be late! What is going on?" Meanwhile, Luna stood nearby, ears perked, tail wagging with a sense of quiet pride. She didn't seem to be in any hurry to help, not that she needed to. She had done her job perfectly. The guests were now firmly trapped in the mud, and there was no escaping it. By the time the third car came through, a large truck, the same pattern repeated itself. The tires hit the edge of the pit, then sank deeper with every desperate turn of the wheel. There was no going forward. The truck, like the others, was now stuck, completely immobilized, engines revving as if they could will the vehicle out of the muck. The guests, now frantically scrambling out of their cars, were met with a hilarious sight. High heels sinking into the mud, tuxedos splattered with the dirty remnants of their vehicles' attempts to escape. Some were slipping, others were yelling at each other, and the air was filled with a mix of frustration and disbelief. "How did this happen?" one woman shouted, looking at the dogs as if they were the ones who'd conspired against her. The dogs, on the other hand, were content. Diesel was standing back now, watching the chaos with the kind of satisfaction only a well-trained ranch dog could have. Luna had circled back to stand by me, her eyes gleaming as she took in the sight of the guests, each one now knee-deep in the mess they'd unknowingly walked into. Duke, of course, was still bouncing around, his enthusiasm unchanged, but his wagging tail was a little slower now, as if he, too, was realizing that the job was done. The whole scene was a mix of utter chaos and strange humor. Guests were pulling at their shoes, cursing under their breath, and trying to figure out how to get their vehicles free, though none of them had any luck. Some of them attempted to push, but it was no use. The mud had a grip on them now, and it wasn't letting go anytime soon. I couldn't help but let out a small chuckle. The whole thing had spiraled out of control in the most unexpected way, and yet the dogs had handled it with a kind of precision I never could have predicted. The guests, though frustrated and confused, couldn't seem to get mad at the dogs. They were just too innocent, too unaware of the chaos they'd caused. And as I watched Diesel, Luna, and Duke standing there, proud and unmoving, I realized that maybe, just maybe, they were the true masters of this ranch. They had taken control of the situation without lifting a paw to do it. They didn't need to bark. They didn't need to chase anyone down. They just led the guests into the mud. And honestly, I couldn't have been prouder of them. As the dust, or rather mud, began to settle, I couldn't help but stand there for a moment, watching the scene unfold in front of me. The guests, now completely out of their cars and covered in splashes of muck, were starting to realize exactly what had happened. There was a bit of a stunned silence at first, a collective realization dawning on them as they stood knee-deep in the mess they had unwittingly walked into. The woman in the pink dress, still holding her shoes in one hand, was the first to speak up. "This is ridiculous," she exclaimed, looking down at her once perfect outfit now coated in mud. She shot a glance at the dogs who, as always, seemed completely unfazed. "What is wrong with these dogs? Why did they lead us here?" Her tone was a mix of confusion and frustration, but there was no denying that a hint of helplessness was creeping in. Others joined in, muttering complaints about the mud, the dogs, the chaos. Some of them were starting to laugh at the absurdity of the situation, though it seemed to come more from disbelief than actual humor. They were stuck, physically, mentally, and a bit emotionally. It wasn't just the vehicles. It was the entire situation that had gotten away from them. I stood off to the side, arms crossed, watching the guests scramble and argue about how to get their vehicles unstuck. It was hard not to feel a little bit of satisfaction, even amusement, at the irony of it all. Here I was trying to politely get them to move their cars earlier, and now they were caught in the very situation I had been trying to avoid. The dogs had done their job, with barely any effort, and the results were both unexpected and oddly fitting. The guests had come in with no regard for the space they were occupying, and now they were being forced to face the consequences. I caught Diesel's eye, and for a moment it felt like we shared the same thought. He stood a few feet away, casually watching the madness unfold, his tail barely twitching. Luna, ever the professional, had already started to circle back, her head held high, as if to say, "Mission accomplished." Duke was still trotting around, blissfully unaware of the growing tension among the guests, but his presence only added to the absurdity of the situation. A few guests were now trying to push their cars out of the pit, but the wheels just spun helplessly in the mud. Someone had grabbed a nearby shovel, only to find it useless against the thick, sticky earth. It was clear that no amount of effort was going to solve the problem quickly, and the realization was slowly sinking in that they'd be here for a while. As the minutes passed, the frustration slowly turned into a kind of reluctant acceptance. Some of the guests started helping each other out, pulling shoes from the mud, laughing at the ridiculousness of their predicament. But there was also a sense of quiet embarrassment hanging in the air. The kind of feeling you get when you realize you've just become part of an unintentional joke, and there's no easy way out of it. I didn't say anything. I didn't need to. The dogs had said everything with their calm, quiet movements. The guests had ignored the land, ignored the rules, and now they were paying for it in the only way the ranch knew how. A muddy, humbling reminder that things don't always go as planned. As the situation simmered into resigned chaos, I couldn't help but feel a small sense of vindication. There had been so much tension earlier, so much frustration over the simple act of getting my driveway cleared. And now here they were, guests who thought they could waltz in, take up space without thinking, and disrupt the flow of my day, stuck in the very mess I had tried to avoid. I glanced over at the dogs again. They were still standing there, the unspoken heroes of the day. They didn't need any recognition. They didn't need praise. They'd done what they always did, kept watch, made sure things ran smoothly, and, whether they knew it or not, served up a bit of justice in the most unexpected, ironic way. As the wedding continued, the muddy incident gradually faded into the background, though not without its share of lingering murmurs and exasperated sighs from the guests. Karen, bless her heart, seemed oblivious to the whole ordeal. She was busy making her rounds, laughing and chatting with her guests, oblivious to the muddy chaos unfolding just outside. At one point, she popped her head out to check on the vehicles, but by then the guests were mostly trying to make the best of things, despite their less than ideal situation. A few guests had managed to get their cars unstuck, though they were covered in mud from head to toe. Others had resorted to asking the local tow service to come help, which predictably took longer than anyone had hoped. But after a while, they all seemed to come to a collective, unspoken agreement. There was no point in getting too worked up over it. The wedding was still going strong, and the party was already moving indoors. The muddy mess outside, while inconvenient, had become just another oddity in the day's events. I stood off to the side watching it all play out. It was hard not to feel a little smug, knowing that the situation had resolved itself, though not in the way anyone had planned. The guests, now laughing at their own ridiculousness, were slowly making their way back to the barn for the reception. Some were joking about the mud pit incident like it was the best part of the day, even if they didn't fully appreciate the irony of being stuck in their own mess. A few of the more resourceful ones even started using the mud as a bonding experience, sharing a laugh over their shared misfortune. The cars were eventually cleared, but the damage was done. The driveway, once pristine, now looked like a battlefield, with tire tracks cutting through the once perfect gravel. It was an odd contrast to the perfectly manicured event Karen had worked so hard to organize. The driveway was no longer just a part of the ranch, it was a reminder of what had unfolded. As the night wore on and the wedding reception continued, I couldn't help but reflect on how everything had turned out. The frustration that had built up over the blocked driveway, the polite requests that had gone ignored, and the growing irritation with each passing minute, all of that had led to something far more chaotic, yet strangely satisfying. The dogs, as usual, had stepped in, handled the situation in their own way, and in doing so, had provided a solution no one had seen coming. It wasn't the way I would have planned things, but in some odd, roundabout way, it worked out. The guests had learned their lesson, even if it wasn't exactly how I would have hoped, and the ranch, with its ever-watchful dogs, had reminded everyone that sometimes things happen for a reason, even if that reason is a little muddy. The event might have gone off without a hitch in most respects, but in the end, it was the dogs, with their quiet yet firm guidance, that had brought a little balance back to the chaos. As the night came to a close and the last few guests slowly trickled out, the events of the day seemed to settle into a strange, almost comical memory. Sure, the wedding had continued on, the laughter and music filling the barn, but for everyone who had been involved in the mud pit incident, there was no escaping the fact that things hadn't gone quite according to plan. The driveway was still a mess, and a few of the guests had spent hours trying to get their cars cleaned up. But amidst all the frustration, something else had happened. They learned, albeit in a very unconventional way, to respect the space they were in. Karen, at least, seemed completely unaware of the deeper lessons that had unfolded outside. She went on with her celebration, blissfully oblivious to the muddy chaos. But I knew that her guests, who had spent so much of the day preoccupied with the wedding itself, would walk away with more than just a memory of the ceremony. They'd remember the dogs. They'd remember the frustration, the slipping in the mud, and how, despite their best efforts, they had been led into the mess they'd ignored earlier. And while they may not have realized it right away, they had learned to respect the ranch in a way they hadn't before. As for me, I couldn't help but smile to myself. It had been a frustrating day at the start, but it had also been unexpectedly satisfying to see the dogs step in and take charge. Diesel, Luna, and Duke had handled the situation with the kind of grace and confidence only a ranch dog could have. They didn't need to bark or chase anyone. They didn't need to shout or get angry. They simply did what they were born to do: watch over the land, protect it, and guide those who wandered into it. And in the process, they'd taught a few lessons along the way. Lessons the guests would likely never forget. It was a perfect reminder that sometimes things don't go as planned. Sometimes the world throws a little chaos your way, and you just have to roll with it. The wedding might have been about Karen and her big day, but in the end, it was the dogs who stole the show. They led the guests through the mud, quite literally, and shown everyone that sometimes a little bit of disruption isn't just unavoidable, it's necessary. And in the grand scheme of things, maybe that's how it should be. Life is messy, unexpected, and full of twists. But if there's one thing I've learned, it's that the dogs, with their quiet wisdom and instinctive sense of right and wrong, will always find a way to handle whatever comes their way. And sometimes that's the best lesson of all.